Hi, everyone. My name's Andrea Coomber. I have the great privilege of being the Chief Executive of the Howard League for Penal Reform. Thank you so much for joining us on this sunny summer's evening for this really interesting chat with Angela Kirwin, who is the author of a recently released book. I'm afraid this is the earlier version. I've given my new version away to somebody to read, but Criminal, a book around how our prisons are letting everyone down. And we're really thrilled that Angela's come to join us tonight to talk about her book and what's motivated her. She's going to talk about a bit about herself and how she came to write the book. And we'll be delighted to answer your questions later in the session. Angela's a recovering social worker who spent a long time in prison working with prisoners of all different kinds, and she'll talk about that work tonight. And we're really thrilled that she's decided to join us to talk about her experiences. I'm also really happy to have Ben Leapman from next week, the editor of Inside Time, who will be known to many of you, a very renowned, successful journalist who we're really lucky to have in our sector. So Ben's going to provide some more questions because I'm a sort of a more chatty conversationalist. He's going to be the hard-hitting journalist question person. I think that's not true at all. In any event, we will be recording this event and it will be put up on our website later. Please put any questions you have for Angela or Ben into the Q&A box rather than the chat box. Into the chat box, feel free to put anything else you're responding to, or if you've read the book and you liked it or you didn't like it, or you've got a book in yourself and you're starting to write your own book, what that's about, share that with us. But please do put questions into the Q&A box. So Ange will talk for a while, Ben will respond, and then we'll have a conversation and invite questions from you all. Does that sound about right?
Perfect. Yeah.
Right, tell us how you gave birth to this book.
So Criminal is the story of lots of different individuals that I met when I was working in prison. And the book itself, it was never a book I wrote to be published. The very first draft of this book about the criminal justice system and about people in prison was completely different to what it is now. So in my job in prison, I worked in a social care role, and I ran groups almost every morning. And these groups became a very safe space. They became a real peer support group where the men I worked with talked about their feelings and worked through their problems together. And I realized that their advice and their wisdom was just unparalleled. Then their knowledge, their reflection, their ability to talk about their emotions was something I hadn't really experienced on the out before, especially with groups of men. And so the first version of the book was almost a kind of a self-help manual. So what can we learn from the men who are locked up for hours just to think? I thought they were full of intelligence and wisdom, and I just started journaling what I was learning from them to begin with, and how what I learned from these men could apply to me and my life. But as I continued writing the stories of the men I worked with in prison, I started to feel anger and frustration coming through. I started to realize this wasn't a story that could be told lightly. And I needed to be quite honest in my rage about how failing the system was. And I needed to put that into my writing as well. And I think I was quite fearful to begin with of adding this kind of political voice to of any backlash to that or being very controversial. But as I started to research everything that I knew that was failing in the system anecdotally, and I started to look at the evidence and the data that showed what I'd learned about individuals, the data and evidence was showing my anecdotes about everyone in prison having mental health problems, or 1 in 6 people going through the gate homeless, or people just being set up to fail upon release from prison. I realized that this just all backed up what I knew to be true, that prison was failing. And I realized that there is nothing controversial in saying that prison does not work. And there shouldn't be anything controversial in saying that to be humane and compassionate to people, regardless of their previous actions, is not controversial. Because we all want to live in a safer society. We all want to live in a fairer, better society. And my writing as I went along made me realize that the only way to do that, to make fewer victims in the future, to make sure crime is reduced, is to be compassionate and humane to the people who are in prison. And that's that's how the book developed, from this journaling just about my thoughts and feelings towards this book that it is now, where I center an individual in each chapter who has a different issue, because I want to show the humanity behind the walls in prison. But then I want to also show that these aren't just anecdotal stories. I want to show that for every person in prison on remand, there is data to show there's 10,000 other people in prison on remand. Or for everyone who goes through the gate homeless, there are thousands of people who go through the gate homeless. So I wanted to kind of marry this personal story with all this data that shows prison does not work, and that there is a better way. There are other countries that do things better than us. There are other countries that have fewer people in prison, and yet their crime is no higher. And I wanted to show that we can make a change. So by the time I got to the final edit of the book, I realized that I wanted to write a book. I wanted the book to be something that, if you're having a conversation with people about prison and you don't feel like you're the expert on it, you fundamentally know that prison's wrong and you don't like how it is, but you feel like you can't argue against the people who say, but what about the murderers? What about the pedophiles? Or the people who say, well, it's like a hotel. I wanted to arm the reader with a book that will allow you to have intelligent conversations with people who perhaps don't initially agree with that argument, and hopefully educate people to have conversations based on facts and truth and evidence as well. Sorry, was that too long, or is that okay?
Absolutely perfect. And just for those of you who haven't read the book, how it's structured is that each chapter begins with I think most chapters begin with a personal story of one of the men that Andrew's worked with, and delves into a particular aspect, whether that's mental health or drugs or race, or and then after telling us, they're generally pretty miserable stories, sad stories. Some of them sort of inspiring, but often kind of dreadful, because we know prison is dreadful. There's then kind of the context of why this person is just one of thousands of people who are in exactly the same boat, and how he's symptomatic of broader problems and what the alternative solutions might be. So that's how the book is structured. And I think that's what, for me, made it very easy to read, amongst many other things. Like, it is a very digestible, sort of snacky sort of book. Mm-hmm. Strange adjective.
Ben, sorry.
Snacky, yes, there we go. Your thoughts, Ben?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very realistic book that does give a good insight into prison life for people who don't know about it, and I hope that lots of people, do pick it up and read it, if particularly people who don't have personal experience of being in prison or family members in prison, because it is a mysterious world behind those high walls, and people don't know about what goes on there. And I think Angela does give a really, really clear description of the sort of people that there are on the wings, and the sort of way that they spend their days, which is so strange. I mean, Angela says in there, it's easy to turn a blind eye to horror if it's hidden, and I think that's absolutely true. People don't know about it, and therefore they don't care about it so much. One of the things I found as a Fleet Street journalist writing about home affairs is that editors love stories about immigration, about crime, about terrorism, but when it comes to stories about prison, they're just not interested, unless it's prisoners who escape. Then they're interested, but that's because they've come and joined the readers in the outside world. While they're behind the walls, it's not that interesting, because people think, the editors think, that readers don't really care that much, and sadly I think that's probably often true. A lot of the public don't care that much, and they should. So I hope that if they pick up this book, that will shed a bit of light and a bit of humanity onto it, and make them care a bit more. At the end, Angela includes a list of things, sort of action plan of things that the public can do, which is great, not least because number one on the list is to subscribe to Inside Time newspaper, which of course I think is a fantastic idea. But you know, it's good that if you get people, motivate people to be involved, and then suggest ways that they can do that. That's great. Obviously, it's not a happy read because it's not a happy system, and Angela makes pretty clear that, you know, she's what her view says. She says the prison system is inhumane, or prisons are inhumane, and the criminal justice system is fatally flawed. And the stories don't have happy endings usually. Most of the individual tales that she tells, although of course you do admit, Angela, that the ones who do have happy endings are the ones that you didn't see again. So
absolutely,
among the ones you didn't see, did go on to lead better and fulfilling and happy lives on the out, as many ex-prisoners do, you know, but at the same time many don't. So
and I think just with that, with the issues that you brought up about talking about different issues in different chapters and how do we get people to care about prisons, I think every single issue we see in prison, whether it's homelessness, mental health, systemic racism, all these problems are things we really care about in the community. We really now are starting to care about these things in society. And if you do care about a social cause that you think isn't related to prison, it's probably magnified and probably is a bigger problem or part of that social problem with prison as well.
I found it very interesting that since that recently Robert Buckland, the former Justice Secretary, has very much taken on board the issue of people on the autistic spectrum in prisons. And Matt Hancock, the former Health Secretary, I interviewed for last month's Inside Time, and he's now very passionate about the cause of people with dyslexia in prisons, which is, as you say, the issues that people care about on the outside, they're magnified in prison. If people have got autism, people got dyslexia, those are difficult at the best of times, but in prison where there's no help for it, it's worse. One might wish that both those two individuals had perhaps focused on those issues whilst they were in office rather than after leaving, but even so, it's great to see them as converts to the cause.
Definitely. Yes, I think that's so true. And if we can allow people to relate the issues that they care about in the society to prison as well, I think we can make more people care and more people aware that it's not just them versus us. They're part of our communities, the people who are in prison. They will be released one day. And it's our duty as citizens, as members of communities, to kind of join that together as well, and to bring people back into our communities. We have a role to do that as well.
I think the other thing that you emphasised at various junctures is just how much it all costs. Like it's failing everyone, and yet it costs a fortune. I was told last week by someone who would know that the average cost of a child in prison is between £200,000 and £250,000 a year at the moment. Which is 5 kids at Eton. That's, I mean, it's just extraordinary to think what you could do to support somebody with £250,000 a year, and then the experience of the kids that call our advice line every day at the Howard League.
And I think this is what I found so one of the chapters in the book is about my experience of going to the Norwegian prisons. And the Norwegian prisons, they are more expensive. They're really focused on rehabilitation. They are focused on education, training, supporting people back into the community, and they are more expensive than our prisons in the UK. But if we look at the costs associated with reoffending, I know, Andrea, you made the really good analogy in one of your talks where we spend 18 billion a year on reoffending in this country. And I think that was the cost you said for the whole of the Crossrail development over the past decade, was something like the same price as this, but we spend that every single year on reoffending. So it's not that we don't have the money to reform and rebuild our criminal justice system. We're just directing it in the wrong places. And we could really direct it towards rehabilitation. We could direct it towards community sentences that are often much more successful than prison sentences. So the money is there. It's just we put it into the wrong places at the moment. And I think that's really troubling when we see The prison estate is expanding in this country. We already have the highest incarceration rate in Western Europe, but we are adding another 20,000 spaces that should be open by about 2026. And these are private companies who are winning millions of pounds in government contracts to run and maintain additional prison spaces. And in the time of a cost of living crisis, we need to look why this is necessary, why private companies should be given millions of taxpayers' money for a system that we have data that shows it does not reduce crime to have more prisons.
Yeah, I mean, that program is now the latest. I don't know if Ben's seen more recently, but the latest figure I saw from MOJ was it's now 4 billion to do the new prison places. It was 3.1 at the time I did my Palmore lecture. It's gone up to 4 now in their statement. And then that doesn't have the every year costs of.
Yeah, the story that we was Inside Time splashed on a month or two ago was the figures from this rather obscure government accountancy unit, but had calculated that the cost just of the new places, of the 20,000 new places, was going to be £60 billion for building them and then running them over their lifetime, their 60-year lifetime. So that's £60 billion, which if we just kept the prison population at its current level, already the highest in Western Europe, as we know, that just wouldn't be needed, that money. That could be spent.
Yeah, it's amazing, really, isn't it?
And I think this is the thing that I've really tried to do in the book is when emotionally you say, I don't like prisons, I don't think they work, I don't think they're cost effective, there's then the data and the evidence to back that up and show that actually this isn't cost effective and this doesn't work and we don't need to be doing this. And that's a real, I think that's a real like weapon in your arsenal when you're talking to people and trying to convince people and having meaningful conversations about, well, what can we do instead? Well, we can do things that are much cheaper, like having community sentences or like not sending women to prison because they're usually in for non-violent crimes. So I think talking about the money is a really useful thing to do when people aren't sure they care about the people yet. And then hopefully my book will also make people then also care about the people too, because the people I met in prison were incredible. Yeah.
I think that's absolutely right. There are some people who are never going to be convinced by the human stories, but they might be convinced by sort of fiscal conservatism. And then there'll be other people who won't care how much it costs and that will be entirely about treating people decently and having good outcomes for individuals, meaning good outcomes for the community.
Perfect, yeah.
Ben, do you have other questions for Ange?
Yeah, I was interested in the actual work that you were in prisons doing. I mean, your book uses that, your experience as a springboard for talking about the whole prison system. But just in terms of the work that you do, I found one of the strangest things about prison, just how little rehabilitative work actually happens. I mean, out of the accredited courses, the sort of official gold standard courses that the system offers to try and turn prisoners, rehabilitate, and which the parole board sort of likes to see people having done, there's only 5,000 a year nowadays completed, which is out of the prison population of 80,000, and it's fallen by 40% in the last decade, the number of these courses being done. You refer to yourself as a care bear, I think, one of that have the staff knew you, the other prison officers.
That's what the old school officers definitely called me, one of the care bears, yeah.
But what I mean, that's the courses you were doing were not accredited courses then, whether they were sort of optional extras. And I wasn't aware that even happened in prisons. I don't know how common that is.
So yes, so my experience might be a little bit different to like other prison books people have read, because I didn't work in one of these prisons that has long-term sentenced people in. So I always worked in what we call Cat B local prisons. So if you live in any big city in London, Liverpool, Manchester, you will see these Victorian huge buildings somewhere in the city. And these prisons typically just take people directly from the courts. So someone will be arrested, spend a night in a police cell, go to the courts, come into our prison, usually on remand. So they've not had their court hearing yet. And then they'll go back out, have their court hearing, come back to us to then eventually in their prison sentence go on to hopefully a Cat C or a Cat D prison where they can rehabilitate. So working in these Cat B locals, you can have 90 new people arrive each morning and 60 people go home each day. So there's this real churn. And perhaps that is what allowed me to do my job because I didn't deliver accredited programs in my job. Or I did a little bit. So in part of my substance misuse work, I would deliver accredited substance misuse groups. But I was in prisons where they're in the 2010s, where violence was increasing, staff were reducing, spice had started flooding the landings, and no one really knew what to do to control the violence, to control the self-injury. So I was given a little bit of free rein to do something that worked. And initially that was with what we would call the top 25 kind of mad and bad in the prison. So the people who didn't fall into the mental health team because they weren't psychiatrically unwell, and perhaps their substance misuse issues weren't typically heroin or alcohol, the things that the healthcare team really had to get a grip on quickly. So I was kind of told, deal with the people who are causing lots of problems, whether they were causing problems through self-injury, if they were causing problems through lots and lots of assaults and violence. So the people who were taking up lots of time and attention from the staff, but didn't really fit into any other team. So I was kind of just given this caseload of go and do something that works. And I intuitively thought that running groups where we can talk things through, create a real safe space that was voluntary. And the voluntary aspect was really important to me, that people can come and go as they want. You do not need to have a diagnosis to work in these groups. You do not need to be engaged with the substance misuse team. You can come and go as you want if it will benefit you. And this created a real safe space with people who, although they may have been in and out on very short sentences, it was typically a relatively stable group of people, because typically people who are on very short sentences will come back into prison at some point. And when they did, they could come back to the group and that space. So that was part of my job. I then, amazingly, we managed to secure some funding from a borough in London that paid part of the money to the substance misuse team to set up a through the gate service. So I would work with people specifically from that one London borough who had substance misuse issues in prison. And I would escort them on their day of release back out into the community and follow up with them for 6 weeks afterwards. So we secured these little pots of money to set up these little projects. But yes, it's not typical in prisons. So by the time we were inspected by the inspectorate, they really highlighted the work of this group session that kind of didn't fit into anyone's categories, but they really highlighted it as being something like, this works, we should be doing more of this. But this is where I found we can't just do things that aren't evidence-based, which is when I then went off to America, to Norway, to actually start researching and trying to gather data and evidence to show what I was doing was working, but also like why it was working. So yes, went off to Norway, collected lots of evidence on that, wrote a big report about that, and came back. And that's when I started to be given the freedom to then run even more groups with people who were maybe affiliated to certain, what we would call gang lifestyles, I suppose. Yeah.
And now that you're no longer doing it in prisons, are there other Angela Kirwins doing that role, or is that sort of just finished in other prisons around the country?
I think there are probably individuals who are really going above and beyond their job role, doing similar things. I know particularly in Brixton Prison, I have heard that they're really trying to do some joined up working between the mental health teams, the healthcare team, the substance misuse team, and they're really trying to kind of pioneer a new approach that does something similar. So I know that there are prisons trying to do this as well, but not that I know of specifically, no. And I think COVID's changed a lot of that. We have to understand that although we now all have our freedoms back and none of us are under lockdown, plenty of prisons, the social care staff are really struggling to get groups back up and running, or any meaningful activity back up and running for rehabilitation too.
Any other questions there? I'll just.
I mean, do you have a view on all the sort of the accredited behaviour course? Did you see how they were doing, the psychologists and doing their job? Do you think that they were helpful? Because there is criticism that some of those courses are not all that evidence-based. You refer in the book to the fiasco over the sex offender treatment program that got withdrawn when the figures suggested it was increasing rather than reducing reoffending. Do you think that sort of job is, I mean, it's done in rather low quantities, as like my 5,000 figure suggests, but do you think it's done well? Did you see the evidence, the outcomes of it in improving people's behaviour? And
so my experience with accredited programs is that people are really care and are trying to do good work. And when we're talking about accredited programs, yeah, you've mentioned the sex offender behaviour programs. An accredited program could be around substance misuse. It could be around anger management. So there's lots of different accredited programs. And there is more and more controversy that actually the evidence that they help reduce reoffending is minimal. Now, I think accredited courses can be very good in that they teach a number of soft skills that we don't measure. They teach people how to engage in group activities, how to be off the wing and develop pro-social behaviors and also like these pro-social relationships with other people. So I think the problem we have with having accredited behavior programs and only measuring the outcome of them as reducing reoffending is quite problematic, especially when I think the root causes of people's problems usually come down to issues in society of poverty, issues around lack of housing, lack of access to employment, lack of access to appropriate healthcare for substance use issues. So I think accredited programs can have a positive impact. However, I think they are a band-aid, they are a plaster on what actually is this huge societal problem where we allow people to slip through the net as soon as they're released from prison. And I think no program in prison is going to equip someone if they're going through the gate to homelessness, if they're going through the gate to insecure housing, or if they're going through the gate even to situations where they are expected to go to the chemist every single day to take their methadone. How can this person ever get a job if that's what they're expected to do? So I think the issues run deeper than even looking at the accredited programs. I think they are a nod towards rehabilitation, but I don't think they actually look at the underlying issues that cause criminality in the first place, usually.
And another question, may I?
Yeah, go for it.
In your final chapter of your book, you have a very long sort of wish list of improvements that you'd like to see, from reforms to sentencing to repairing crumbling prison buildings, more therapists, more psychologists, better training for prison officers. But is that what one change do you think could make the most difference?
So I've really been thinking about this because I've been doing these kind of like 5-minute soundbite interviews in other places. So I'm like, what can I say that's just a quick win? And I think one of the real quick wins is stopping sending people to prison for 12 months or less. I think all the government's own data shows that short prison sentences do not reduce crime. People are more likely to be able to go straight, be able to sort out their lives if they do a sentence in the community. So this is something that the government knows works, their data shows it works. It means we're not paying £44,000 to house someone in prison and they will come out in a worse situation than they started. It means we can actually work with someone to build their lives and become an active member of society again. And I think this is a real vital one because although I don't talk about women in the book, I don't talk about women in prison, this is a thing that I think would incredibly have an incredible impact on the prison estate very quickly. Most women are not in for violent crimes. Most women are more women than men are sentenced to very short sentences. If we can show that having community sentences for women or dealing with women in any other way other than sending them to prison for 6 or 12 months, which for women is especially problematic if their children are removed from them, but also because they can be extremely vulnerable when it comes to issues of housing. So I think this is a quick win. Get rid of those short sentences that don't work, that cause lots of churn in the prison estate, cost lots of money, and don't reduce crime. And then I think my next suggestion is, I think we need to look really sensibly at our laws around drugs. I think we need to look at countries that have decriminalized drugs. I think Portugal is an incredibly good example where they have not legalized drugs. So it's not like there are drugs everywhere and it's a free-for-all. But what they have done is said that if people are found with drugs, they go in front of a panel with a psychiatrist, a social worker, and are offered support to manage their substance misuse problems rather than a prison sentence. And this treats substance misuse issues as the health issue it is rather than the crime issue it is. And we need to have an adult conversation around this. I saw when the London mayor kind of even just went and looked at the way cannabis was being legalized in some other countries, there was just vitriol in the media about this. We need to stop with the sound bites and the rhetoric and actually look at the evidence and the data around substances and if they need to be illegal in the first place at all. I think, yeah. We've
started to get questions into our Q&A.
Okay.
I will ask some. Alice has started with an easy one, which is, do you have thoughts on how best to break the cycle of intergenerational offending?
Oh, that's a very, do you want to go, Ben, first?
I have to ask, I'm here
definitely
asking.
That's a social worker.
I know you're, so there is a chapter in my book where I cover this, where I look at someone whose parents were very chaotic, parents were in and out of prison, parents had substance misuse issues, and this kind of almost like inevitability that they ended up in prison. And there's lots of data that shows this, that if you're in prison, it's way more likely that you have known someone in your family who's been in prison. And my answer in this chapter of the book is we really need to bring back a Sure Start model into our communities of support for families. We need to really fund our children and families social work teams in the communities, rather than just waiting for someone to get into prison and then kind of putting them in a group therapy session with me to try and rehabilitate. And I think the Sure Start model had its faults, but on the whole, I think this was an incredible system that got to communities where there was intergenerational criminality and problems like that, and really changed people's lives. And it's such a shame that in the past decade, we've seen them just decimated. And my dream would be to bring back a model like that into the communities.
I mean, it's that thing about the answers not being in prison at all. Like for most of these things, it's all what Anna calls the not prison answers.
Yeah, definitely.
Another question here, maybe this is one for you, Ben, but it's wondering your reflections on the plans to spend 200 million a year, 22, 24, 25, on reducing reoffending in the prison's white paper. Are these the right interventions?
Well, I think that the current government's strategy and under Dominic Raab has been very much talking about and focused on work for ex-prisoners, bringing workshops into prisons and training apprenticeships, which have now been approved for prisoners to do. Coupled with some changes to the barring system, whereby the convictions that will become spent more quickly, so that one doesn't have to declare them to potential employers. I think those are all positive things. I mean, I think the best, whether they say that the things that will prevent an ex-prisoner from reoffending are a friend, a home, and a job. Mm-hmm. And I think that those are positive moves on the jobs front. And on the homes front, it's rather hard to quite untangle what the MOJ is doing and when they're doing it. I don't think they've been clear about the timings, but they have said that they want to provide housing, temporarily at least, for all ex-prisoners so that no one leaves prison homeless. I mean, that's a fantastic aim if what they're doing actually achieves that. And it sounds expensive, and I, as I say, I don't quite know if they've set timescales for when it's supposed to happen, but they are expanding. They've done it in a few regions during COVID. They're doing it in more regions. So that those are laudable aims, which could really make a difference. I mean, that's what you have to focus on to prevent reoffending. I think it's getting ex-prisoners into jobs, and it's getting ex-prisoners into housing, and those are not easy to do. I mean, with the jobs, you know, there's a huge resistance from employers, but I think the government does appear to be pushing in the right direction on that. So that's something.
Yeah, I think that we see these schemes, and there's some things that are coming out that look really good, like the idea to not release prisoners on a Friday, because if you don't know this, it's being released on a Friday. If you have to sign on to your probation, you have to try and get to the housing office, you need to sort out your medication. It is terrifying. And there are times when I went through the gate with people and left them to rough sleeping that night because we went out on a Friday and I knew there was no one else to provide support over the weekend. So I think there are some things that are really laudable. I think my concern, though, is that any criminal justice system that centers incarceration as its only option in this kind of fight against crime is flawed and failed, and will fail when we keep looking to prisons as the answer, and they haven't been the answer since we built these old Victorians nearly 200 years ago. And I think the government schemes are really interesting, and I think getting more employment into prisons will be incredible for the people who are currently in prison. But I do think we also need to be a little bit braver in our ambitions and say, actually, prisons themselves are a problem, and maybe we should be looking at other options within the criminal justice system rather than just incarceration as our first port of call for everything.
Yeah. One of the people in the chat, let me just pull it up. Oh gosh, it's gone. Sorry. Sorry, too much in the chat. Standout. Bronwyn said, Standout charity offers support to prisoners pre and after release. And I think I was just reminded with that there are loads of fantastic third sector initiatives up and down the country that are really providing amazing. I was at a event last night for Shift, which kind of puts resource around young kids and in danger of offending. And there are these fantastic initiatives by the third sector, but they're no substitute for a system fundamentally that is kind of evidence-based and fair. And for me, as someone who's worked in the charity sector for 25 years, I'm always kind of concerned when it's the third sector that's left to provide the great initiatives, and these are small organisations that live on fresh air and commitment. And I was with the Nelson Trust last week in Eastwood Park and in Gloucester at their women's centre. I mean, these are fantastic, amazing initiatives that really change lives, but they are putting bandages around people who have been ruined themselves by the system. So I think there is this sort of tension to kind of make sure we don't just say, oh, well, there are lots of great initiatives, and actually look more fundamentally. I think that's what you're asking in the book, Andrew, is to look more fundamentally at what the building blocks of this system are and how actually they're just flawed and they just operate to marginalise and damage people and create more offenders at the end of the day.
And I really do think, and I hope I highlight this enough in the book, that I think there are amazing people who are working tirelessly in the sector. But as we say, these are pockets of work where you have to reapply for your funding every 12 months. I know, we set up the Through the Gate service and then showed that it was being successful, but immediately already had to put in the bid for funding the next year. And as you say, you're living on the commitment of the staff and very little stability and security in your job. And if you only have these pockets of work, then you can, as I'm speaking, I suppose, from my own experience, you can feel very disheartened. You can feel like you're alone fighting the system. And this is where, when people have been asking me, okay, like, what can I do? I think organizations like the Howard League are places where you can get together with other people trying to do great work, and not feel so isolated and not feel so alone in the work you're doing, and try and create a change that we can all push forward together.
Yeah. Let's have a look at some more questions. Do panelists have thoughts? I know definitely Ben and I do, about Rab's recent assault on parole, transfer to Cat D and release of prisoners. Any thoughts on that, Ben? Ange, have you been following the latest rule changes?
Go for it, Ben.
I think it will. It looks as if it will make a difference, although the announcement was not very clear about exactly how it's happening and what's happening. It was more of a kind of direction of travel than a really clear statement, and I think it will worry people who are imprisoned and in that position of being a lifer and looking for a transfer, because the way the parole board works, if you're a life sentence prisoner, it wants to see evidence that you've been sent to an open prison and have been able to be there successfully and not escape or cause trouble before it will sanction your release. And if these new rules make it harder for some life sentence prisoners to get to an open prison and they're kept in closed conditions for longer, then they won't be able to demonstrate to the parole board what's going on. And I think particularly surprising was the focus within that announcement on public confidence, because that suggests that the prisoners who've had their stories in newspapers because they're high profile will therefore find it harder to get to an open prison than others, which
I think that's certainly one of the things we're concerned about. Yeah, I mean, I think it really risks derailing people's progression if you've committed a horrible offence a long time ago, but you've been working towards release, and then open is part of that, especially for people who've been in prison for a very long time. It's a really important step, and for that to be put in danger, it's hard to imagine how, given that those decisions should be about risk at the time of the move to open, how risk and public confidence could go together. I think invariably it's going to go back to sort of the index offence. We've actually had some of our lawyers have talked to children, young people in custody who've had notes slipped under their doors telling them about the rule change and these lifers about the move to open, and just calling us wondering what it all means. Because I think already it's kind of, it's an unsettling kind of idea.
To reflect the other side of the argument, I can understand the concerns of people who live near open prisons, and they do seem to have quite regular absconds. And the purpose of open prisons isn't really very clear, I don't think, because on the one hand, it's said that they are because they're low security, that they're for prisoners who are lower risk, but actually 1,500 of the 5,000 people in low prisons are not low risk, they're medium and high risk. They're high and very high risk. And they are there because their lifers need to demonstrate their suitability of open prison. But actually, there are lots of prisoners who are on determinate sentences who are much, much lower risk. There are prisoners who are aged in their 90s or 100 who are completely physically incapacitated and are totally incapable of walking down a corridor, let alone escaping. And yet they're kept in closed conditions, whilst young, fit men who are high risk are put in open prisons. And I think that is puzzling to the public, I think, and probably warrants a bit more explanation as to what open prisons are for.
Yeah, we'll certainly be doing, whoever's asked this question, we'll certainly be doing more work on this over the next few weeks and are looking into that. Oh, this is what always happens. You get towards the end of an event and then everyone starts piling their questions in. Let me see.
I found one that I really want to answer. Can I answer it?
Yeah.
So it was, someone's asked, did you find in Norway that the general public were much more aware of the realities of prison life, or the general public in Norway? And I found that this is kind of related to that issue of open prisons. So in the 80s and 90s, the general public and the consensus in Norway, or in the early 90s, was that prison was for revenge and retribution and prisoners are dangerous. And there was this change in attitude. And this came from the top and from the bottom, but it actually came from a lot of prisoner-led reform organisations. And the general public in Norway now really have the attitude of who would you want as your neighbour? Because just like in the UK, almost everyone who's in prison in the UK will be released one day. And the general public in Norway had embraced this. And I think they were more aware of the realities of what was going on in prison, because even in the very high security prisons, there is less of a barrier. So there are the physical walls. However, community services come into the prison, companies from outside come into the prison, colleges from outside come into the prison, and prisoners, even the very high security prisoners, will go out of the prison at times as well. So there's much more of a flow of prisoners back and forth, and the community back and forth into prisons. And I think this made people more understanding of why a rehabilitative model was really important as well. So yeah, that was the question I really wanted to answer.
I think the funny thing, I've got a couple of Norwegian friends, and not only do they know about prison, they're really proud of their prisons.
Yeah.
Like, and I'm not sure, I don't know that there'd be anybody really who's proud of our prisons. I mean, really, like, you can't imagine anyone saying, yes, they're tip top.
Yeah.
Like, even, and then the vast majority of people just don't have a clue, because we don't see into them, short of a kind of Jimmy McGovern documentary drama. More and more questions. Thank you, people. What help is there for IPP release prisons? And you have a whole chapter on IPPs.
So IPP, I think, is one of these prison topics that, because you can't kind of explain it in a soundbite, people don't know about it and don't care. So if you don't know about IPP, please go and find out. Please Google it. Please have a look at the organizations campaigning for reform of this inhumane sentence. And my only experience of IPP was with people who were still in prison. And we talked a little bit earlier about accredited programs. So the gentleman I talk about in my book, he was expected by the parole board to complete accredited programs to be allowed to be released from prison. Those programs did not exist in our prison. He was on a waiting list to go to the prisons to do the programs where there would be another waiting list, and he would not be released until he did accredited substance misuse programs. And instead, he looked at me, realized I was running these groups. This was something he could do in our prison. And he came every single group I ran. He did every single piece of homework I asked of him. He stayed drug-free during his time in a prison that was filled with drugs. And yet the parole board thought that he was at risk of relapse on release and refused him parole because of this. And he was at risk of relapse upon release. Of course he was, but he was also at risk of relapse in prison. And that's what happened when his parole was knocked back. And that's probably one of the hardest things I've ever had to do, is go to a parole board with a man who has no release date, who was in prison because he told his parole officer that he'd relapsed. So he had not committed another crime. So my experience of IPP is the whole system is inhumane, it's terrible, it needs to be overturned. It was overturned in 2012, so we can no longer sentence people to IPP sentences. We need to re-sentence every single person who is currently in prison on an IPP sentence. And we need to do that immediately. There are about 2,000 people in prison who are over their tariff for reasons purely because of the type of sentence they were given. So
we've got members who are 15 years post-tariff.
Exactly. But with regard to what support they get, my experience and my knowledge is they get the same support as someone who is on license. They get a probation officer that they need to work with. They need to obey license conditions. And if they do not obey these license conditions, they will come back to prison indefinitely. And many of these license conditions are things like don't use drugs and alcohol. And the majority of people recalled for breaching license conditions are not recalled for committing a crime. They're recalled for what their probation officer calls problematic behaviour, or a mental health breakdown, or a substance misuse relapse. So I know that they get that support, but when that support means that they have to come back into prison when they are struggling, I don't think that's any support at all. But that's just my understanding of it. I don't know, Ben, do you know more about the specific support for IPP prisoners upon release?
I think, as you say, it's that they get a probation officer, and off you go. Good luck with it. And of course, the risk of recall, which is an indefinite one because it's a lifelong license. Although there is now more of a move to review it after 10 years after your first release. It can be reviewed and lifted by the parole board if you seem to have turned your life around. So that's a positive. And I guess politically looking forward, we're awaiting the Justice Select Committee will shortly be producing its report on IPP, which the government has suggested it will then respond to. Maybe that will be a more substantive change in the system that we've seen up to now.
Yeah.
Conscious that we're running out of time and we still have a lot of questions. There's a question here saying, could you talk a bit more about residential women's centres? Is it a model that could work for men? Yes, the Nelson Trust run residential centres for men as well as for women, and they do work. I think that's clear. It's just perhaps the rollout of it's not as broad. I'm not so sure on what the obstacles might be to that, but it's something we certainly want to explore. And one person's asked a question. She basically wants you to spoil the end of the book. I think it's a fair enough question, saying I love the book and I wonder why you left your job that you're so good at, that you're passionate about.
I left my job because at the end of the time I was working, I was being asked to do mental health assessments through locked cell doors. I was trying to change lives in a classroom that's not figuratively, but literally like flooded with human excrement because the toilet's blocked. And my group of prisoners, the group ended up in biohazard suits for the day, wiping excrement off the floors instead of doing group therapy. And I just thought this was a complete analogy for how I felt about the failing prison system. And I think for my own sanity, I had to leave. I no longer felt safe in my job, in that the wings did not feel safe anymore. There was homicides, there were escapes. There were escapes that were literally escapes by people cutting through the bars on their windows. So there were weapons like that in the prison that were able to cut through metal bars and get out the metal bars. And in that environment, I don't think I could keep the hope alive. And I think if I couldn't keep the hope alive, it wasn't fair to stay and do it without that passion and that hope. I think with time away, I would love to kind of go back into this sector, but I think I need to give my energy to changing the system. I think that's the way that I can most help the people I worked with and most support them. Yeah.
I'm afraid we've got far too many questions to get through them all. There is one question Nicola asks about what the Howard League, organisations like the Howard League can do to turn around public opinion in the UK. And I'm very open, Nicola. If you know the answer to that question, you must get in touch. We are very committed to working across the sector with media outlets to bring alive the experience of people in prison and to challenge all of this nonsense that people, every time one of me or one of our staff talks on radio in response to an inspection report, we do get these people who sort of say, so what that kids are getting locked up and stabbed at Warrington. Like, I don't mind if that happens to the kid who steals my car. This kind of, it's not a helpful discourse, and we have to challenge that all the time, or that prisons are like holiday camps, or all of this sort of nonsense that we know is not true. But I'm very open to any ideas you might have about how to do that. Angela, what do you think would work? What can work, other than buying your book and sharing it with everyone, which obviously...
Yeah. No, I'm not very good at the promotion, so I should really say that at some point. So buy the book, do that, yeah. And I've been thinking about this, and we've been having this conversation about having purposeful conversations. And I wrote the book because I do not want my policy made by government. I do not want my taxes spent on sound bites and rhetoric. I want them spent on what works and what makes society a better place. And I think with the publication of this book, I was expecting a lot more kickback and a lot more negativity than I've received. And I think people genuinely are good. I think people want to be part of a community and want to live in a nice society. And the majority of people don't want to just punish people if it makes us all worse off for doing so. So I think if you do feel this way, you do feel that you want to make change, you need to be having purposeful, meaningful conversations. You need to be challenging these sound bites when you hear them. and spreading the message that as a general public, no, we don't want our money spent on these things. We don't want policy that just dehumanizes people and is cruel to people purposelessly. And we need to challenge that in every conversation we have, I think. And that's what I've come up with so far as what we can all do and take away from like events like this and do tomorrow to go forward.
Ben, what do you think? What's the answer?
I think, as you said originally, if anyone knew the answer to that, it would have happened already, like a lot of the big problems in life. But I mean, I think there is a little bit of encouragement that in America, which is, you know, not a liberal hotbed and is very big on imprisonment, the debate there has shifted to the extent that even Donald Trump was actually promoting releasing prisoners, a few prisoners, and prison reform as an issue. So it can reach a turning point. And as you mentioned in Norway, you said it's not always been like that. The position has changed. And I think Holland the same. So it can happen. But obviously with the media that we've got, the public opinion is not necessarily going to shift overnight.
Yeah, and this is the thing, it won't shift overnight, will it? But I think Norway is a really hopeful example of a country that didn't always feel this way. And it shows that we can also change if we keep trying. Yeah.
Angela, I want to come back to one of the things you said at the very beginning, was that this was not your original book. So your original book was lessons learned from the men you were talking to every day. What's one of those lessons that you've taken away and you can share with us?
Oh, I mean, I think my original chapter titles were along the lines of like, it is what it is. You can't control the situation. You've got to control your response to the situation. What else? I think the biggest lesson I learned is that people are innately good. I believe in the good in people, and no matter what they have done, I think 99.9% of people were not born bad. I think people are trying their best in the situations they're in, and sometimes people make bad choices, and they should not be punished for the rest of their lives because they've made some bad choices, especially if we support people to be their most self-actualized version of themselves, they can be real contributing members of society. So yeah, people are all right. That's my outcome.
Great way to end this discussion. Ben?
Can I just point out on that when it comes to chapter titles, I think your chapter title of 10 in your book, Can't Drive a Lambo Around the Exercise Yard, is hard to beat. I think that's
some of the best advice from my young gang members, which we would never call people gang members. It's true, you can have all the money in the world, but you can't drive the Lamborghini in the exercise yard, can you?
Angela, Ben, thank you both so much. I'm going to clap. Nobody else is going to hear.
Okay.
Imagine there are 64 people clapping at home. My apologies to those questions we didn't get to. I'm afraid we were just overrun with questions. But thank you for our audience for engaging so positively in this discussion. A few things you need to do. Obviously, you need to go away and buy the book. I see some people have just bought it. It is a really great read, and it's a good thing for those of you who don't know much about prison, you'll know much more at the end of it. For those of you who know about it, it's a nice way of synthesizing it, and you can pass it on to people and make them read it or buy them copies for their birthdays and stuff. Second thing, obviously, you must all go and subscribe to Inside Time. It's a fantastic paper. And the letters page that comes in, I just think is every month just like such window into what's happening in prison. And it's a sort of really quite hopeful space, and you see the kind of people who are in prison and the things that they're dealing with. And finally, if you're not a member of the Howard League, you must obviously sign up and become a member of the Howard League. So please do that. We have another event, which is on the 20th of July between 1 and 2. It's a lunchtime event. I'm afraid it's also with another journalist, with Tristan Kirk from the Evening Standard, talking about what it's like in the moment in the criminal courts. And please join us for that. We will then have other events that don't involve journalists. It's a little journalist heavy at the moment.
Should all involve
nothing wrong with that. Thank you, Ange. Thank you very much, Ben. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and have a very nice evening.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.